With most countries having introduced measures against the coronavirus and the pandemic continuing to claim a loss of life, attention has been turning towards reflection. Did the government act in a timely manner? Did they inform people well enough? And have they been doing enough? But what's more is that these issues are starting to be asked in court. Without pretending to have answers to the questions we've just asked, today we're going to discuss the nature of the legal claims that have begun to surge. We'll talk you through what people are seeking to achieve through legal action, who they're targeting, and what their chances are. Before we start, I just wanted to thank our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. Their support helps the channel and makes it possible for us to put so much time and effort into these videos. If you want to support us, and if you want to get a bunch of perks in return, then consider backing us on Patreon. You can find out more by clicking the link in the description below. Let's start with the basic legal stuff. In law, there are several kinds of legal domains. The one we're interested in today is called tort law. Tort law is an area of law which is concerned with liability. Basically, it sets rules to answer the question, what happens if I suffer damages because of someone else? This question is more complicated than it seems at first glance, because it deals with the question of fault. Situations in which questions of tort law arises can be anything, ranging from a car crash to the publishing of gossip in newspapers. Funnily enough, one of the most fundamental cases of the law of torts in the UK concerned a decomposing snail in a bottle of beer. The customer opening the beer was so disgusted by it that she started feeling sick. She then sued the beer company for negligence in the manufacturing process and won. In this landmark case, the court defined the core concept of duty of care, which establishes a rule that people must take reasonable care not to injure others who could foreseeably be affected by their action or inaction. We find similar principles in basically every other legal system across the world. Where a victim has suffered damage because of another, tort law is triggered and the victim may have a case for compensation. This brings us to the context of the coronavirus. If you remember the quote from the judgment, people are under an obligation to make sure, where reasonable, that they're avoiding harm to other people because of their actions or inactions. It's precisely this that the coronavirus claims are about. In essence, their argument is that they've suffered harm in forms ranging from financial problems to the loss of a loved one, and that governments, companies, and others have not done enough to prevent it from happening. For this, they want some kind of compensation. At TLDR, we don't think it's our position to judge whether these claims have merit. And that's at least partly because no single case is the same. This is also why it's very hard to come to a general conclusion about whether these claims, in the context of measures against coronavirus, do or do not have a chance in a court of law. Let's take you through some of the difficult questions that are important in tort law claims. First, the type of damage you suffered and the extent of the duty of care upon the other party are very important. This is because the court will have to establish that the party had a duty of care towards you to prevent you from suffering harm. If the party is very remote to you, the court might not consider it reasonable to say that such an obligation is reasonable. For example, say you book a flight to New York, where you have a very important job interview that could change your life. In fact, you're almost certain that you're getting the job. Even if the court can establish that it's the airline's fault that your flight was cancelled, it will be very unlikely that it will consider it reasonable that the airline has to pay you the salary that you missed out on due to you missing the interview. Secondly, it matters a lot which party you're going to sue. For one, you want to make sure this party has the money to actually pay you with. Otherwise, you might end up only bankrupting them, but not actually getting anything out of it. Also, if you're suing a state in a foreign country, you're entering the field of international law, which changes the matter drastically. Further, the question of reasonableness changes. Recall the case of the snail in the beer bottle. The victim didn't sue the owner of the bar, but rather the manufacturer. But it should be noted that the glass that the beer was poured into was completely opaque. The lawyers of the claimant therefore thought that they had a better case claiming that the manufacturer should clean and check any bottles before it seals them, rather than claiming that the bar owners should check every bottle of beer before serving it, even if you can't see through the glass. As such, it's important not only to establish a duty of care, but also to whom this duty falls. Closely related to this is another crucial aspect: foreseeability. Could the beer manufacturer have foreseen that not cleaning bottles properly could cause serious health issues? Well, the court thought yes. What's important, therefore, is not so much whether or not you foresee that your actions could bring about harm to another, but whether you should have foreseen this. Yet another thing to consider is causation. Did the other person's failure actually cause you harm? Or was it not something external that did it instead? Related to this, courts also have to consider something called contributory negligence. Perhaps the claimant did something to himself that caused the risk of harm to become high enough to basically say, you yourself could and should have known. You can't now blame another. So imagine that the victim passes all of these tests. Is it a closed case? Well, no. Still, there is an important question to answer. Namely, was it all the defendant's fault? Or did some overwhelming external factor lie at the heart of the issue? This concept bears the fancy French term force majeure, literally meaning overwhelming power. The question of whether such an external power existed and whether it was overwhelming will too have to be answered before the court can grant any sort of compensation. Knowing this, it's safe to conclude that the court has to consider a lot of questions in tort law cases, and it's clear why it's so difficult to establish if a case has any chance of success or not. So let's take a real-life coronavirus-related example. A group of friends travel to Austria in early February for winter holidays. They know that the coronavirus is present in Austria, but checking government websites, they do not find any concrete advice against travelling there, so they decide to go. Entering a relatively packed pub at night, one of them becomes infected, and after a week or so, he starts to show symptoms of illness. His situation gets so bad that he ends up in intensive care, where after a few days, he sadly passes away. Only a few days after the friends entered the pub, the Austrian government introduces strict lockdown measures against the virus. Knowing this, should the Austrian government compensate the friends and family of the deceased for negligently keeping the pubs open? Arguments the claimants might raise include that the Austrian government could have looked at the record of other countries, in particular Italy, and taken proper and timely measures. They could have known what the consequences for not doing so would have been, and yet they did nothing. Furthermore, it's reasonable for the friends to have relied on the Austrian authorities to find out whether or not it was safe to go, and they found no such advice. But equally, arguments could be raised against the claimants. The Austrian authorities did do all they could, consulting with experts and closely monitoring the situation. Further, the friends themselves could have known that going to a packed pub when the coronavirus was prevalent was not the best idea. And finally, did the absence of measures from the Austrian authorities cause the loss of life? Did he not get the virus somewhere else other than the pub? As you can see, these are all very difficult questions that judges will have to answer. What makes the present situation unique for the field of law is the global context of the issues. Judges around the world will be faced with these kinds of questions, so it can be expected that they'll look to each other for advice. Similarly, cases succeeding and failing will give lawyers and other clients opportunities to learn. And finally, the nature of the pandemic is such that not even scientists have certain information as to how the virus spreads, what good certain measures are, and what could or should have been done, let alone judges in court. But not just that, some cases are particularly sensitive. For instance, where they target the state of China for silencing doctors around sounding the alarm in the early stages of the pandemic, and for not disclosing information to other countries and the WHO in time, or at all. And what happens if hospitals are sued when claimants argue that they did not properly prepare their facilities and get enough PPE while the virus was on its way? So despite the fact that probably none of us are pandemic experts, what do you think about these claims? Do you think that there's any legal merit behind them? And do you think that it's a good thing that these questions are being raised? And finally, do you think that bearing in mind that courts will have to consider some of these issues, that the claims surrounding them will be successful? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and you can also get involved in the conversation over on Discord. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a video. You can also find more from us across all social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. Special thanks to our Patreon backers for making videos like this one possible.